Have you ever imagined the stories a taxi driver can accumulate over the course of his rides? Today, we're going to explore 7 scary and chilling tales involving taxi drivers based on true stories that will leave your hair standing on end. Get ready to dive into a journey full of mystery and tension. And before we start, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content like this. Let's go. 1. The Shadowless Passenger. It was a cold, silent night in New York. Cab driver Michael, accustomed to driving through the city's busy early hours, parked his yellow cab on a dimly lit street corner on the Lower East Side. The fine rain made the streets glisten under the reflection of the street lamps. As he waited for the next customer, Michael drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, fighting fatigue. He was about to grab his coffee from the console when he saw a figure emerge from the darkness. The man wore an impeccable black suit and carried a leather briefcase. Although it was raining, he looked dry, as if the water avoided touching him. He waved to Michael with a discreet smile and got into the car without saying a word. "Good evening," he greeted the passenger in a deep, calm voice. "57th Street, near Central Park, please." Michael nodded and started the engine. As he drove through the wet streets of Manhattan, he tried to strike up a conversation, as he did with all the passengers. "Quiet night tonight, huh?" The man just smiled through the rear-view mirror, but didn't reply. It was then that Michael noticed something strange. The passenger had no reflection in the rear-view mirror. He blinked a few times, thinking his eyes were playing tricks because he was tired. But that wasn't it. He looked again at the back seat through the mirror and saw nothing but emptiness. Trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that was beginning to grow in his chest, Michael continued driving. But then he noticed another disturbing detail. Under the soft light of the car's dashboard, the man cast no shadow at all. Michael's heart began to beat faster. "Is everything all right?" asked the passenger suddenly, as if he could sense the driver's tension. "Yes, everything's fine," Michael replied, trying to sound natural. Silence again dominated the room until the man spoke again. "You've been driving these streets for a long time, haven't you?" Michael nodded without taking his eyes off the road. "You must have seen a lot of things, maybe even things you'd rather forget." These words made Michael grip the steering wheel tighter. How did that stranger know so much about him? Before he could answer, the man continued. "For example, that night on 34th Street 7 years ago. Do you still think about that?" Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. No one knew about it. It was a secret he kept with all his might. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, trying to hide his unease. The passenger laughed softly, a sound that seemed to echo inside Michael's head. "Of course you do. Guilt has a peculiar way of following us around, like a shadow that never goes away." Michael hit the gas, desperate to reach his destination and get rid of that mysterious man. But the streets seemed to stretch on endlessly in front of him, as if he were trapped in a labyrinth with no way out. "Who are you?" shouted Michael at last, unable to contain his anguish. The man leaned forward, approaching the driver's seat. His face was now partially illuminated by the dashboard light, revealing deep, penetrating eyes. "I am what you fear to face," he replied calmly. "I am the shadow of your choices." Suddenly, images began to invade Michael's mind, flashes of that fateful night on 34th Street. He saw himself arguing with another man in a dark alley. He heard the muffled screams and felt the weight of the gun in his trembling hands again. It was something he had buried deep in his conscience, but was now being forced to confront. Tears began to stream down Michael's face as he drove aimlessly. "I had no choice. It was self-defense," he shouted in despair. The passenger just watched in silence like an impartial judge waiting for the defendant to finish his confession. Finally, the car stopped in front of an abandoned building on 57th Street. The passenger opened the door and got out, without saying another word, before disappearing into the darkness of the sidewalk, wet with fine rain. He turned to Michael and said, "The truth always finds its way, even on the darkest nights." When Michael looked through the rearview mirror again, he realized that his own reflection had also disappeared. He was alone in the empty car, surrounded only by the distant sound of the city and the unbearable weight of his conscience. 2. The Race to the Beyond. It was a cold, rainy night in London, and Thomas, an experienced taxi driver, was used to the unexpected events of the city's early hours. The streets were deserted, except for the sound of raindrops hitting the windshield and the occasional glow of street lamps illuminating the wet asphalt. He was about to end his shift when something happened that would change his life forever. Stopping at a traffic light on the corner of Fleet Street, a woman appeared out of nowhere, desperately banging on the cab window. She was bloodied, wide-eyed, and gasping for breath. "Please take me to St. Thomas's Hospital," she begged, her voice shaking. Thomas hesitated for a moment, but when he saw her condition, he unlocked the back door. The woman quickly got into the car, holding the left side of her abdomen as if trying to contain a serious injury. Her clothes were torn and covered in blood. "What happened to you?" asked Thomas as he sped through the narrow streets of London. She didn't answer directly. She just mumbled something inaudible while staring out of the window, as if she was seeing something he couldn't see. Thomas tried to stay calm and focus on the direction. "We're almost there. Hang in there," he said, trying to reassure her. But when he looked in the rearview mirror to check on her, his heart stopped for an instant. The back seat was empty. The woman had disappeared without a trace. He stopped the cab abruptly in front of St. Thomas's Hospital, completely stunned. He looked in the back seat again, but there was no one there. Only a blood stain on the seat confirmed that she had indeed been in the car. Desperate and confused, Thomas went into the hospital and told the nurses what had happened. They looked at each other with suspicious expressions and said that no patient with those characteristics had been admitted that night. Disturbed by what had happened, Thomas returned to the place where he had found the woman the following evening. He hoped to find some logical explanation. Perhaps someone had seen something or knew who she was. It was then that an elderly man selling newspapers at a nearby stall told him a chilling story. Years ago, a young woman died in a terrible accident at this very intersection. She was hit by a car as she was running towards St. Thomas Hospital to get help. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. The man continued, "Many people say that sometimes she comes asking for help, but never reaches her destination." Incredulous and terrified, Thomas decided to investigate on his own. He went to the local library and searched through the old archives of the Times newspaper. After a few hours flicking through yellowed pages, he found a headline dated 1975. "Tragedy in Fleet Street. Young woman killed by car while seeking help." In the photo in the article was the same woman who had got into his cab. Over the next few days, Thomas tried to carry on as normal, but he couldn't get the event out of his mind. He started talking to other taxi drivers about his experience and discovered that he wasn't the only one to have had unexplained encounters in the early hours of the morning in London. A colleague called George told him that he had also once picked up a mysterious passenger near Highgate Cemetery, someone who had disappeared before reaching their destination. Intrigued and obsessed by the story of the woman in Fleet Street, Thomas began to do more research into supernatural phenomena in London. He discovered that stories of ghost passengers were more common than he had imagined, especially in old cities like London, where every street corner seemed to hold dark memories of the past. One evening, while driving along the same route where it all happened, he felt an inexplicable chill as he passed the Fleet Street junction again. The cab's radio began to squawk, interrupting the soft music that was playing. Suddenly she heard a whispered voice. "Thank you for trying to help me." The message was brief, but clear enough to leave him paralyzed. After that final incident, Thomas decided to view his experience not as something frightening or disturbing, but as a call to something greater. He came to believe that perhaps he had been chosen to be a bridge between the living and the dead, someone willing to listen to the unfinished stories of those who still wandered the streets of the city. Although he never saw that woman again, he continued driving through the streets of London with a new perspective on his work and on life in general. Every passenger who got into his cab was now a unique opportunity, whether to hear stories from this world or help lost souls find peace. And so Thomas continued his nightly journey through the historic streets of the English capital, carrying with him not only ordinary passengers, but also the invisible memories of those whose stories still echoed in the shadows of eternal London. 3. The End Point. It was a cold, silent night in Guanajuato, a historic city in the heart of Mexico, famous for its narrow streets and labyrinthine alleyways. Fog covered the colonial mansions as Santiago Lopez, an experienced taxi driver, waited patiently for the next call. The clock on the dashboard read midnight. He was adjusting the radio to listen to the local news when the driver's device beeped. "Customer waiting at Santa Rosa Cemetery." Santiago frowned. It was unusual to receive calls from a cemetery at that hour. He hesitated for a few seconds, but work was work. He started the cab's engine and drove through the deserted streets to the place indicated. When he arrived, he saw a figure standing in the flickering light of an old lamppost. He was a tall man, wearing an old-fashioned black suit and holding a hat in his hands. His posture was rigid and his skin had a pale tone that contrasted with the darkness around him. "Buenas noches," greeted Santiago as he lowered his window. "Were you the one who called the cab?" "Yes," replied the man in a deep, quiet voice. "I need you to take me to Calle del Olvido, number 13. Santiago felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew the address well. It was a house that had been abandoned for decades, destroyed by a fire that had wiped out an entire family. Despite this, he just nodded and unlocked the back door. The man got into the car without saying another word. A peculiar smell pervaded the interior, something between mothballs and wet earth. Santiago looked through the rearview mirror and noticed the passenger's rigid features, deep-set eyes and a solemn expression. "Do you live there?" Santiago asked, trying to relieve the tension. "I used to," replied the man after a long pause. The dry answer made Santiago swallow. He decided not to continue the conversation and concentrated on the winding road that led to the outskirts of the city. As they approached Calle del Olvido, the feeling of unease grew. The streets seemed darker, as if the light itself was avoiding them. Finally, they reached their destination. House number 13 loomed before them like a sinister shadow. Charred walls covered in moss and broken windows that looked like empty eyes staring into the night. "Here we are," said Santiago in a trembling voice. The passenger remained motionless for a few moments before slowly opening the door. He got out of the car without saying anything and walked towards the entrance of the house with firm steps. Santiago watched through the rear-view mirror until the man disappeared into the darkness of the building. Something inside him told him to leave immediately, but his curiosity was stronger. He turned off the engine and got out of the car. As he drove through the rusty gate, he felt a strange pressure in the air, as if he were being watched by invisible eyes. He called out to the passenger, "Senor, are you all right?" No answer came. He entered the partially destroyed house and was greeted by an oppressive silence. In the center of the main room, there was something that caught his eye. an old portrait hanging on an intact wall. Santiago approached to take a closer look and felt his heart stop for a moment. The man in the portrait was identical to the passenger he had just brought there. Suddenly, he heard slow footsteps coming up the creaking stairs. Against every survival instinct, he followed the sound until he reached the top floor. At the end of a dark corridor was an ajar door with flickering light escaping through the cracks. He pushed the door open slowly and found the man kneeling in front of an unlit fireplace, holding something in his hands. An old pocket watch. "Senor, are you all right?" Santiago asked with difficulty. The man slowly turned towards him, revealing empty eyes that shone with a supernatural light. "I've finally come home," he said with a disturbing smile, before disappearing before Santiago's astonished eyes. The clock fell to the floor with a dry sound as the room plunged back into total darkness. Santiago ran out of there without looking back, got into his cab, and sped off through the deserted streets of Guanajuato. When he finally stopped to catch his breath in an illuminated square in the city, he looked in the rearview mirror. And there was the old pocket watch on the empty seat. 4. The Lost Child. During a rainy dawn, taxi driver John was driving along a deserted road when he spotted a small, fragile figure on the edge of the asphalt. It was a child, soaking wet and shivering with cold, with eyes that seemed to carry a deep mystery. Worried, he stopped the car and quickly got out. "Is everything all right? Where are your parents?" he asked, trying not to frighten her. The child, a girl of about 8, didn't answer immediately. After a few seconds of silence, she mumbled an address. John hesitated, but the heavy rain and the girl's condition convinced him to help her. He opened the car door and put her in the back seat. As he drove to the address, John tried to strike up a conversation. "What's your name? Do you live near here?" Once again, the girl remained silent, staring out of the window into the darkness of the night. Something in her expression sent a shiver down the cabbie's spine, but he put it down to tiredness and the unusual situation. The address provided led him to an old, dimly lit street. As he pulled up in front of the house indicated, John felt an inexplicable discomfort. It was an old building, with broken windows and signs of abandonment. He turned around to speak to the girl, but realized that she was no longer in the car. Confused and alarmed, John got out of the cab and looked around. There was no sign of the child. He called out for her several times, but only the sound of rain answered. Determined to investigate, he approached the house. The door was ajar and creaked slightly in the wind. Inside, the atmosphere was even gloomier. The smell of mold permeated the air, and furniture covered in dusty sheets indicated that no one had lived there for a long time. As he cautiously explored the rooms, John found an old newspaper on a table. The headline read, "Family brutally murdered in abandoned house." Next to the headline was a photo of the victims, a couple and a little girl who looked eerily similar to the child he had found. John felt a shiver run down his spine. He began to connect the dots. Could the girl be a spirit trapped in that place? Before he could fully process his thoughts, he heard light footsteps coming from upstairs. Against his rational will, he climbed the creaking stairs. At the top of the stairs, she found a children's room decorated with old toys and faded wallpaper. In the center of the room was the same little girl he had seen on the road. She held a worn teddy bear and looked at him with sadness in her eyes. "Are you all right?" asked John again, his voice trembling. "Thank you for bringing me home," she finally replied, her tone soft and melancholy. Before John could say anything else, the girl disappeared before his eyes like smoke dissipating into thin air. The taxi driver remained motionless for a few moments, unable to comprehend what had just happened. He hurried down the stairs and left the house without looking back. Back in the car, he sat behind the wheel and tried to catch his breath. The rain continued to fall heavily outside, but inside him, Something had changed forever. Over the next few days, John researched the history of the house and discovered disturbing details about the crime mentioned in the old newspaper. The family had been murdered for reasons that had never been clarified, and many locals believed that the girl's spirit still roamed the area. The experience left a deep impression on John. He avoided that road during his nightly runs and often wondered if it was real or a figment of his exhausted imagination. But deep down, he knew. On that rainy night, he had crossed paths with something beyond human comprehension, something that carried eternal pain and longing. And so his life went on, with memories of that night silently haunting him whenever he heard the distant sound of rain against the cab windows. 5. The Phantom Passenger. It was a rainy, silent night in the city. The streets were almost deserted, and the sound of raindrops hitting the roof of the cab created a melancholy melody. Liam, the taxi driver, was at the wheel, as he was every night, trying to earn enough to support his family. He had been driving for hours, but there were few runs on that cold night. It was then that he spotted a man standing on the sidewalk, waving with a certain urgency. The man seemed ordinary at first glance. He wore a dark suit that was a little creased and bore a tired but kind expression. As soon as he got into the cab, he settled into the back seat and said, his voice low and serene, "Please take me to St. Michael's Hospital. My wife is admitted there." Liam nodded and started the car. During the journey, the passenger started chatting, something Liam always enjoyed to break up the monotony of the long evenings. The man talked about his wife Emily, describing her with such affection that Liam couldn't help but smile. "Emily is the most incredible woman I've ever met," said the passenger, his eyes shining with emotion. "We've been married for 15 years. She's always been my fortress, you know. But now I'm the one who has to be strong for her." Liam glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man's expression change to something darker. He continued, "She had an accident a few days ago. She's in a serious condition. The doctors say there's hope, but it's hard not to think the worst." The taxi driver tried to comfort him. "Have faith, my friend. Sometimes life surprises us in ways we can't even imagine." The man thanked him with a slight smile and went on to talk about happy times he and Emily had shared. Trips to Lake Louise, simple dinners at home, and long talks under the stars on summer nights. Liam felt touched by the story. It was rare to find someone who spoke of love with such sincerity. When they arrived at the hospital, Liam parked at the main entrance and turned around to tell the passenger the price of the ride. However, to his surprise, the back seat was empty. The man had disappeared without a trace. Confused and restless, Liam got out of the cab and walked into the hospital. He went to the reception desk to try to understand what was going on. "Good evening," he said to the receptionist. "I've just brought a man here. He said he'd come to visit his wife, Emily. Could you check if she's in hospital?" The receptionist looked at him strangely before consulting the records on the computer. "Yes, we have a patient called Emily. But she's been in intensive care since a serious accident a few days ago. And what about her husband?" The woman paused before continuing. "He died in the same accident." Liam felt a shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean? That can't be right. I just spoke to him in my cab. He told me about her. He seemed so real." The receptionist shook her head ruefully. Many people report strange things when they are emotionally connected to situations like this. Maybe it was your imagination. But Liam knew it wasn't imagination. He could still hear the man's voice in his mind, remembering every word that had been said during the journey. Not knowing what to do, he got back into the cab and sat for a few minutes in absolute silence, trying to process what had happened. That night, Liam couldn't get any more work done. He drove home, still thinking about the mysterious man and the love story he had heard. Something inside him told him that this passenger wasn't just a figment of his imagination. He believed that he had been chosen to bring that message of love and hope to Emily. Over the next few days, Liam couldn't get the experience out of his head and decided to go back to the hospital to visit Emily. He brought flowers as a gesture of solidarity and asked permission to see her briefly. When he entered the ICU room where she was staying, he felt a lump in his throat when he saw her connected to machines that maintained her vital functions. He approached slowly and left the flowers beside the bed. In a low voice, he murmured, "Your husband asked me to bring you here that night. He talked about you so much. He said you were the most incredible woman in the world." Although Emily was unconscious, Liam felt as if something invisible had changed at that moment, as if a silent presence had thanked him for his words. A few weeks later, Liam received unexpected news. Emily had miraculously begun to recover. The doctors were amazed at her sudden improvement after days without significant progress. Liam never told anyone about his encounter with the phantom passenger apart from Emily when she was finally released from hospital. She listened intently as he recounted everything that happened that rainy night and smiled with tears in her eyes. "This is exactly the kind of thing my husband would do," she said softly. "Find a way to be with me even after he's gone." Since then, Liam has come to believe that there are things beyond human comprehension, connections so strong between people that not even death can completely break them. And every time it rained at night as he drove through the streets of the deserted city, Liam looked in the rearview mirror, hoping to see that special passenger sitting in the back seat of his cab again. 6. The Endless Road. It was a hot and muggy night when John, an experienced taxi driver, received an unusual call. A group of young people, laughing and talking loudly, asked for a ride to a party in a rural area. Although he was reluctant because of the distance and the late hour, John accepted. He needed the money, and the contagious energy of the passengers seemed to promise a smooth journey. The young people got into the car with enthusiasm. There were 4 of them: Emily, the most talkative; Jake, who seemed to be the leader of the group; Sarah, shy and always wearing her headphones; and Mike, who was more interested in his cell phone than in the surrounding conversation. They gave the directions to the party venue, a farm away from the city, and John started driving. As the cab left the urban perimeter and entered the dirt roads, the landscape changed. The city lights disappeared, giving way to almost absolute darkness. Only the car's headlights illuminated the narrow road, lined with tall trees that seemed to lean over the vehicle as if they wanted to swallow it up. The radio squawked as John tried to tune into a station to break the growing silence. "Are you sure it's this way?" asked John, looking in the rearview mirror. Jake confirmed with a confident nod as he checked the GPS on his cell phone. "Yeah, just keep going. We're almost there." But something seemed wrong. The road had no clear signs or forks, just a straight path that stretched on endlessly. After about 40 minutes of driving without finding the farm or any sign of civilization, John began to get restless. "I think we've been here before," he said, noticing a tree with a crooked branch that looked familiar. The young men laughed, attributing their concern to tiredness. "Relax, it's just you," Emily joked. But it wasn't an impression. The same tree appeared again and again. John was sure they were caught in a strange cycle, as if the road was taking them back to the same point again and again. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, stopping the car on the shoulder to check the GPS on the dashboard. The map showed only an endless straight line, with no landmarks or exits visible. Jake also looked at his cell phone and went pale. "My GPS is stuck. Nothing's showing up." The tension inside the cab increased. Sarah took off her headphones for the first time and whispered, "Maybe we should go back?" But when John tried to turn around, He noticed something even more disturbing. The road behind them also looked identical to the one in front. There were no tire marks or signs that they had passed that way before. Silence overtook the car as everyone tried to understand what was happening. The feeling of being watched grew by the minute. Emily tried to break the mood by saying, "Maybe it's just a prank by the party crowd." But even she didn't seem to believe it. Suddenly, the car's lights started flashing and the engine choked before coming to a complete stop. The group panicked as John unsuccessfully tried to start it again. The darkness around them seemed heavier now, as if it were alive. "Let's get out of here," shouted Mike, finally dropping his cell phone. Everyone reluctantly got out of the cab and stood still on the deserted road, surrounded only by the distant sound of the wind between the trees. It was then that they realized something even stranger. There were no stars in the sky, just an infinite black void above them. Jake suggested they walk along the road in the hope of finding help or some sign of life. Reluctantly, they all agreed and started walking together along the dark trail. As they walked, something began to change around them. The trees seemed to move subtly when no one was looking directly at them. Strange sounds echoed through the forest, footsteps that weren't their own or incomprehensible whispers coming from nowhere. Sarah stopped abruptly and pointed ahead. "Look!" On the distant horizon, there were flashing lights, as if they were the headlights of another vehicle coming towards them. The group ran towards the lights with renewed hope, but the further they ran, the further away the lights seemed to get. Then they realized the lights weren't getting any closer. They were circling around them like dancing figures in the darkness. Desperate, they began to shout for help, but their voices seemed to be absorbed by the emptiness around them. That's when Emily stumbled over something on the ground, a metal object covered in dry leaves. It was an old rusty sign with almost illegible letters, "Welcome to the Endless Road." And panic gripped the group as they tried to understand the meaning of that ominous message. John fell to his knees on the floor, muttering to himself, "This can't be real. This can't be real." Suddenly, a deafening sound echoed through the forest, something between a roar and a distorted human scream. The trees began to sway violently, as if they were being shaken by invisible hands, and then everything went dark. When John opened his eyes again, he was alone inside the cab, standing on the shoulder of the same deserted road. There was no sign of the young men or the strange lights they had seen before. The engine was running perfectly now, as if nothing had happened. Trembling, he started the car and drove in the opposite direction without looking back. But something was still wrong. After a few minutes of driving in a straight line, he saw through the rearview mirror 4 familiar figures sitting in the back seat. And they were smiling. 7. The old woman on the corner. Every evening on the corner of a forgotten street in the city centre, a peculiar figure stood out under the flickering street lamp. An elderly woman, wearing a threadbare coat and holding a worn leather bag, would flag down passing cabs. Her gaze was fixed, almost hypnotic, as if she knew exactly which driver would answer her call. Over the years, the taxi drivers had learned to ignore her. Stories about the old woman circulated among them. Some said she never got into the car, just disappeared. Others claimed she muttered incomprehensible things before vanishing into thin air. But that night, a novice driver, Carlos, decided to stop. As Carlos pulled the cab over, he felt an inexplicable chill. The old woman slowly opened the door and stepped inside without saying a word. The silence that followed was so dense that it seemed to fill the entire space of the car. Finally, she muttered an address, a place outside the city, on a deserted road. Carlos hesitated. Something in her voice sounded wrong, as if she didn't belong in this world. But he needed the money and decided to keep going. As he drove, he tried to strike up a conversation. "Madam, do you live far from here?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She just smiled enigmatically and replied, "I'm going home." The dark road seemed to stretch on endlessly in front of them. The car radio began to emit static, and the rearview mirror seemed to fog up. Carlos looked back quickly and noticed something strange. The old woman's reflection wasn't there. Swallowing hard, he tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks. But then she started talking again, this time more clearly. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked with a tone that mixed curiosity and threat. Carlos didn't know how to answer. Before he could say anything, she continued. "Many people think they can escape it, but no one can." The driver felt sweat trickle down his forehead. He wanted to ask her what she meant, but something in his mind prevented him from speaking. It was as if his own voice had been ripped out. When they reached the place indicated, an old abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, the old woman finally broke the silence again. "This is where it all ends, or begins." She got out of the car without paying and walked towards the house. Carlos stood paralyzed for a few seconds before deciding to follow her. Something inside him told him that he needed to know more. As he entered the dark, cold house, he found only silence and shadows. But then he saw something that made his heart stop. Old photos scattered across a dusty table. In all of them, there were pictures of different taxi drivers. And in each picture, there was also the old lady. Carlos began to back away slowly when he heard her voice behind him. "Now you're part of the story too." He turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Only the echo of her laughter reverberated through the empty walls. Desperate to get out of there, Carlos ran to the cab and started the engine. But when he looked in the rearview mirror again, he saw something he would never forget. His own reflected eyes. But they were no longer the same. Something inside him had changed that night. Over the next few days, Carlos tried to resume his normal work routine as a taxi driver, but something was different. He began to notice strange things. Passengers disappearing before reaching their destination, voices whispering his name when he was alone in the car, and always that feeling of being watched. One night, while driving around the same corner where he had first met the old woman, he saw another figure waving at a cab. It was a young man this time, with a confused and reluctant expression. Carlos stopped next to him without really thinking about why. "Do you need a ride?" he asked automatically. The man hesitated before getting into the car and giving a distant address in the neighboring town. As they drove in silence along the deserted road, Carlos felt something familiar in the air, as if he were reliving that fateful night with the old lady. When they reached the destination indicated by the passenger, another abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, Carlos realized that he was now the one asking the dark questions. "Do you believe in fate?" The cycle had begun again, and those were the 7 horror stories involving taxi drivers that we brought you today. So, what did you think? Which one gave you the creeps? Tell us in the comments. If you like this video, don't forget to like it. It really helps the channel grow and brings you more scary content. See you next time.